Hi, it's Raghu back, and I'm back with Joseph Goldstein. Everybody knows Joseph. I've gotten him from the deep retreat in the deep cold of Massachusetts. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you. It is pretty cold today,
Yeah,
below zero.
really. Yeah, the whole eastern half of the country.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things I want to talk about today. Um, but I'll tell you a little story. Your good friend and partner, uh, Sharon Salzberg, partner in Vipassana, along with Jack Cornfield. Uh, so Sharon and I and a comedian named Duncan Trussell, who we work with a lot, who's very a combination of comedy and spiritual consciousness. He likes to talk about. He loves Ram Dass and all that. So we did a thing also with Ethan Nichtern in New York at ABC Theater, Deepak Chopra Theater, and uh, and so at one, so I had this little discussion with her, which emanated from something previous, where this same comedian Duncan turned to her one day and said, "Sharon, what is your practice day to day?" So she sat there in that present manner that she has, and she said, "I get up, I go down, and I sit on my meditation pillow, and I get real." So then we had a discussion around that. And in this thing, which was in November, I said to her, remember, I reminded her of this story, and I said, so I think we need to flesh this out a little bit about get real. And she changed it. She said, well, I think it's more like getting real is what we're talking about, and we're talking about the difference between our actual experience and the story we tell ourselves and the narratives that we tell ourselves, and getting at the unadorned experience and my thoughts. And in fact, many of the listeners know I was in India recently, and that was a day-to-day thing for me to just talk about, to be here now completely, be in the moment, get real. And I seeing all the projections and the manipulations, it's just exceptional if you spend enough internal time. So I would just love your comments on. I mean, I could say to you, what do you do to get real, Joseph, on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I frame it to myself a little bit differently. Uh, I don't know whether it's because of just the inclination of my mind or where my practice is at now. Um, but for me, the what I've become very interested in and what I'm observing a lot, in myself and also in working with, lots of meditators, is the tendency uh, underneath kind of the simple matter, although pervasive one, of simply getting lost in our stories. But even when we're not lost, even if we've gotten real to the extent of being present. Yeah, so beside the more common situation of just being lost in our stories and projections, as everything Sharon had mentioned, uh, for me, there's a kind of an underlying process that's going on that has become really interesting to me,
Hmm.
and that is even when I'm being present in whether it's in the formal sitting or just in the course of a day. I've noticed, and again in myself and both in myself and with lots of other people, there's a very strong tendency to lean into the unfolding process, even on a moment to moment level. So, we're with something in order for it to become something else. We're
Mm.
with some discomfort in the body and we're trying to be mindful of it in order for it to open or in order for it to diminish. Or, we're with some emotion in order for it to do something or other. So there's very often that what I call leaning into the process, or the in order to mindset, as if we're practicing in this moment in order for something else to happen. And so this energetic leaning in Buddhist jargon, to use the kind of classical description, it's really craving for becoming. We're in this moment, but we want to become something else. So we want the moment to become something else. And this is very, very pervasive. It's often characterizes most of our meditation practice. And so what I've been working on and interested in is just seeing the mind, noticing that. You could say that tendency of the mind, that energetic leaning into the next moment. Even in walking,
I've been really thinking in and about the idea of leaning in and just imagining myself in my sitting practice, in my day-to-day life, and some gargantuan stuff has come up about how much I do that, and without knowing about it, without being aware of it. And it's there's desire involved with it, is expectation involved with it, there's attachment involved. I mean, there's a host of things.
Yes.
I think you need to flesh this out a little bit more here.
Okay. So let me put the largest framework around it first. So in the Buddhist teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the first truth, of course, is the truth of dukkha, or the unsatisfying nature of changing phenomena. And the second noble truth is that of craving, being the cause of the suffering, or the unsatisfying nature. And the third noble truth is the end of craving, to come to some place of peace. So when the Buddha described different kinds of craving, he talked about the one that is most obvious, of course, is the craving for sense pleasures. We like pleasant experiences and pleasant sense experiences. So that's fairly obvious and familiar. The second kind of craving he talked about is craving for becoming. Now, on one level, and in some way it may be the most, I don't know if superficial is the right word, but one aspect of it in classical teachings is when people have a desire to become, to have a good rebirth, in some favorable circumstances in this life or in the heaven realms or whatever. So it's craving for becoming on that level. But what I've found, and something that's more meaningful to me and more immediately applicable, is when I've really seen the craving for becoming on a moment-to-moment level. And I've seen it very clearly in my meditation practice, formally, but also in the course of the day. So, for example, we can be sitting and we're just calmly, feeling our breath. And we think, I'm just being mindful, in breath, out breath. But when I look carefully, I can be feeling the in breath in order to become more calm, or in order to get more concentrated, or feeling the in breath in order to get to the out breath. I mean, it's an energetic leaning into the unfolding process. Right? And that's a kind of craving for becoming. It's like we're in this experience, but we're wanting it to become something else. So this is very, as I say, it's very pervasive. It's, in fact, we often, that craving for becoming on that level really has, in many ways, co-opted our meditation practice. We think that that's what meditation should be, wanting to become, as I say, more concentrated or more calm or whatever. So I had an experience that really highlighted this tendency, and in quite a radical way. In some way, it revolutionized my meditation practice. And it came from recalling a line that we find very often in the Buddhist discourses, in the suttas. It's a line that I had read many, many times, and always just took it as a simple description of how things were. And the line is that whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. So that's, it's obvious. It's something we've all heard in the context of spiritual teachings, endless number of times. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. So for years, I just took it as a simple restatement of an obvious truth. But in one sitting, I was on retreat, this line came to mind. And instead of just dismissing it or undervaluing it, simply as a description, I took it as an instruction. And so I used that line, I brought that sentence into my mind in the very midst of my meditation practice. So I'm just sitting and feeling my body, feeling the breath, feeling all the flow of changing sensations. And I dropped that line into the mix. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. So the effect of doing that was to realize that because whatever will arise will also pass away, there is absolutely nothing to want. Because whatever we might want is just going to be another changing phenomena. So this is particularly, this was particularly useful, not so much in the larger context of our lives, because we want different things and they serve different purposes. So it's not on that level. This not wanting that I found so radically helpful was to drop into that not wanting on the moment-to-moment level in my meditation, that there's nothing to want, because whatever I might want is just going to be another part of the changing flow of phenomena. And what happened in that moment was there was a moment of dropping back from wanting anything, in realizing that whatever it is would also pass away. And that highlighted the truth of the meditation being the practice of not wanting. It's not the practice of becoming. Do you follow? And so the practice has really become practicing not wanting, letting things arise and pass by themselves without that leaning into, that energetic leaning into becoming. So that's sort of where, in terms of becoming real, it's more in that vein that has, at least at the present, has really captured my interest.
Yeah.
And this not wanting, these moments of not wanting, really is a taste of the third noble truth. The end of suffering comes about through the end of craving. So it really all fit together in a quite beautiful and amazing way.
Do you think? I don't know if this matches up in any way. I don't even know if the tradition is that different, but I've spent time in India with a yogi that we met recently, really an accomplished guy who at 12 went off into a cave for 20, 25 years, off and on in the jungle, and has a deep, deep realization. And he talks about it. I think the Hindi term is icha, and he speaks very little English, but just enough. No icha, no choice, choiceless, hot, cold, food, no choice. Does that fit in here a little bit with what we're talking about, not wanting?
Well, yeah, I think it does. That very same understanding was expressed beautifully, in the teachings of the third Zen ancestor, in his teaching
Pedro.
on the faith mind, where it says, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. Make the slightest distinction, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. So it's the same thing. Preferences or choice really has to do with wanting. We're in one experience and we want something else. So again, I just want to reiterate that depending on what level of circumstance we're in, sometimes we need to make choices. So I'm not suggesting that, we go through life without making any choice at all. And I would imagine that, yogi in India would be making some choices during the day, go left or go right or whatever.
Yeah.
But on the meditative level, it's really a profound instruction. And now we can experience what that is like, in meditation and many times throughout the day.
Yeah. I think with him, it was also about, he's obviously reached a state of great non-attachment. And so it's about attachment more than anything. But in terms of where it rang a bell as you were speaking about not wanting and coming to that conclusion over that shloka, the idea of choice is to me part of not wanting, of letting go of that particular attachment in the process, specifically around meditation.
Yes, what you said earlier on, it really ties in and it highlights all the ways expectation, comes into our practice, and that's another kind of leaning or wanting, rather than seeing that the very thing we want, or the aspiration really in terms of the teaching and liberation is about not wanting, non-craving. And to one of the other things that was very valuable for me, which I learned earlier on, than this last little piece. We've all heard, and it's part of the Buddha's teachings, and the Buddha's, in fact, enlightenment song after his great enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. He supposedly uttered this verse, "O house builder, you have now been seen, you will build no house again." That is the house of self or the house of ego. And that verse ends with, "Achieved is the end of craving." So this was really his song of enlightenment. And for myself, and I think for many others, kind of the end of craving often becomes some far off goal. That, okay, if we practice long enough, maybe like that yogi in India, we'll come to the end of craving. And so it becomes a distant goal. But what I realized at one point was that we can practice the end of craving for short moments many times, that we don't have to postpone it until it's all uprooted, right? Which may be a while, at least in my case. But we can actually taste it and practice it, on a moment-to-moment level in the way that I had just described. Letting go of that wanting, letting go of that craving, even if it's just for a moment. But that moment is very revealing and very powerful.
Work in progress is a good way to state it, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly.
Yeah, and well, many people do have, especially first coming on to the path, or even experienced people. There is that grand expectation that there's going to be radical shifts in consciousness, and it's rather a lifelong or many lifelongs work on
Journey.
oneself, a
Yes. Yes.
journey. Yeah, exactly. Oh, let me
You know
just.
what? Just
No,
I just
go
want to
ahead.
add one little thing here, which might help to clarify uh, some aspects of the process. Um, I've really seen that there is a difference in the mind state of expectation and aspiration, but those two often get confused. So it's very possible to have, noble aspirations for enlightenment, for awakening, for service, for lots of things that are really beneficial and wholesome. Uh, but that aspiration, I see that aspiration as setting the direction. Expectation is a kind of craving to have a particular experience that we want happening now.
Yeah.
But of course things don't happen that way. Things happen when the conditions are right for them to arise. And so it's quite possible and even important to learn how to hold the aspiration, because that's what energizes us. That's what inspires us to hold the aspiration, but without expectation in the moment that it should look a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so for me, that distinction
Yeah.
became very helpful.
Central to the Bhagavad Gita as well.
Yes, to act without attachment to the fruit of the action.
Yeah.
Uh,
Joseph, one of the things that came to me through actually through a podcast that I did a couple of weeks ago. It was with a man named Robert Svoboda. I don't know if you know who Robert is.
no.
He wrote these books on Agora, which is the tantric left-hand path of these yogis in India, and his teacher was an incredible being. Was over there while we were there in the 70s. And he wrote these books. And the third book, which I highly recommend, I've been telling him on people on almost every podcast, is called The Law of Karma, spelled out by his teacher, whose name is Vimalananda. And it was a kind of insightful talk that we had back and forth that propelled me to think this needs to be fleshed out, because I think there's such a gross misunderstanding about karma, the laws of karma, what karma is, what effects they have, all the way down to the kinds of things we're talking about right now. Predilection for desire systems in a certain individualization of how that works for us. What are they predicated on? What is our patterns predicated on? And so on and so forth, and reactions and action. So I was actually reading Mindfulness, your book, which I don't know how many times we've that there's so much material. It's a very big book, of course.
It is a big book.
And there's so much in there that we could do 10, 20, 30, 40 podcasts about it and still not exhaust the material. But I was looking through it, and one of the things that I thought would be interesting to bring up in relation to this whole thing around karma, and we can talk about how you see that, but it was around dependent origination, particularly, and that whole chapter in the book. But just to give you an idea of why I was inspired by this. And we were just talking about the Bhagavad Gita, and in the Bhagavatam, which is where the Gita comes from, Krishna says, karma is the guru. In fact, nay, it is the supreme Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to get from you a little bit of your, where do you sit with an explanation of karma and how you work with it in terms of the practice that you have been doing and what you share with people, if you don't mind. Just how karma shapes our experience of the world.
Yeah. So this is a huge topic.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, we're just
And not
inching our
only
way
that,
in.
uh, so yeah, so I'll just talk about it in a way that is not at all exhaustive of it.
Yeah,
Just kind of the things that are coming to mind in the moment.
yeah.
Um, so in a way that for me simplifies it is simply to realize that every mind state that arises, which is arising in every moment, every moment of consciousness, it's colored one way or another by different qualities, whether they're the unwholesome ones of greed and hatred and delusion and envy and jealousy and pride and all of that, or whether the mind states are conditioned by the wholesome qualities of love, generosity, wisdom, metta, loving kindness, compassion. It's very clear that every time a mind state arises, it's conditioning the mind in that way, and I mean, one of the ways of understanding it is that every time a particular state arises, it becomes easier for that state to arise again. And so you could even think of it in terms of, neuroscience, not that my knowledge of neuroscience is so great, but, the understanding that there are neural pathways being created in the brain depending on what is happening in our consciousness, and that different neural pathways are either strengthened or weakened depending on the repetition of the particular mind state. And so this is really the establishment of habit. And every time we do something, the habit of that becomes stronger. And so we can understand karma and the law of it and the importance of it in that we want to take care with what habits of mind are being cultivated, what neural pathways are being strengthened, because each one creates its own kind of inner mental environment. So, we talk about polluting the external environment, but do we think about polluting the inner environment? And we talk about, purifying the external environment. And can we purify the internal environment? And it becomes very clear, when we pay attention, if we notice the difference between how it feels when the mind is filled with greed and when we're being generous. So we don't have to wait necessarily for some, future life to be reaping the the fruits of our karma. We can see it in the moment. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, we experience the ease or the peace of wholesome mind states, and we can experience the suffering of unwholesome ones. What feels better, to be filled with hatred or to be filled with love? So just in understanding this, that in each moment we're creating the inner mental environment, can inspire us to take care with what's being created, knowing that it's going to have an effect. It's not something that happens in isolation, from the rest of the unfolding process. It is actually, each moment is conditioning the process. So that's basically how I see it.
Yeah. Here's yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just, what came to mind was this is another concept that often in the West, some people have problems with, even though within Buddhism, it's a pretty important understanding. And that's the whole concept of merit. And merit is it's the English translation, and perhaps not such a good one, for the Pali word punya. And basically it means the fruit of wholesome actions. And so whenever we do something with a wholesome state of mind, it will bring good results, right? Either in the moment or in the future. But one of the definitions of merit, which I really like, it was described as provisions for the journey. And kind of the accumulation of wholesome karma provides the field, necessary for all the good things in our life, both external things, internal mind states, and awakening. It all comes from the strengthening of what could be called merit or wholesome qualities. So this is another aspect of karma.
Yeah,
that actions actually do bring results.
Yeah, I never. You said it at the very beginning. A difficult concept for us in the West, merit, and I myself, although, I mean, I'm no huge knowledge base around Buddhist concepts, but I have some. I've spent some time with you and Sharon and Jack and other Tibetan teachers, and merit has been there, and it has been like an invisible concept,
right? Yeah.
Until this.
Well, I think
until this moment. That's all.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important, and I would imagine, again, I'm like you with regard to Buddhism, with regard to Hinduism and Hindu teachings. My knowledge is not that great, but I would imagine that the concept of merit is very much in those teachings as well.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for me, the problem is that the English word, it conjures up notions of getting gold stars for good behavior or something.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And not understood properly, it might be conflated with selfish greed or something like that. But in more deeply understanding the concept, it's more a question of understanding what causes and conditions bring about what results. Yeah. So it's really not different than eating healthy food in order to have a healthy body. Right. It's like there's a cause and effect relationship.
Yeah.
And that's true of all of our mind states. So to appreciate that is very joyous, because we actually can empower ourselves, to be walking on a path that leads to greater and greater happiness, providing provisions for the journey.
Yeah.
Just one more thought that comes to mind.
Yeah.
And the more provisions we have on the journey, the more provisions we can share on the journey. And so that also becomes a powerful inspiration, for the practice of what's good.
Yeah. So there's here's an interesting thing from the book I was referring to. Even awareness itself is a karma-producing activity when your self-identification, which is called ahamkara, I believe in Sanskrit, the force which self-identifies with it. So the awareness identifies with it. Inaccurate perception encourages tighter bondage. Proper perception promotes freedom. As self-identification, ahamkara, solidifies, your individual identity. It also solidifies your attachments to your previous karmas and your current actions. All the action you have performed and with which your ego's self-identified act as seeds for karmic reactions, each of which will take its own time to mature and bear fruit. So this idea of even awareness is a karmic producing activity, can be, I guess. And in your book, there is a whole chapter around conditioned nature of perception. And I think there's a real connection here. And if you can maybe bring it out based on what you wrote in the book.
Yeah. I mean, the passage you read seemed quite profound, and it would take a lot to actually unpack everything that
in that thing
was said in that paragraph. But some of the things that came to mind as you were reading it, it is interesting, the nature of awareness. And even within Buddhism, different schools have different takes on the nature of awareness. So it's not that there's a unified understanding among all the different Buddhist traditions of its ultimate nature, but all would agree, as was indicated in the passage you read, that whatever one's understanding of the nature of awareness is, it's not something to be identified with as being self. And yet, even as we see the impermanent nature of phenomena, and we can learn to let go of identification to some extent, at least, with the physical sensations and with thoughts and emotions, we see that as being impermanent, and perhaps get glimpses of their impersonal, conditioned, non-self nature, we still very easily become identified with the one who's knowing it all. So we're observing all this and we're understanding all these things, but we're identifying with the awareness of it. And so we're both reifying awareness, and we're also creating a sense of self, or I, in the identification with it. And so then the I of awareness becomes the reference point for all the observation. And so cutting through that identification with awareness is really an important part of the practice. And in my book, in different places, I talk about how to cut through the identification with consciousness, with awareness. So just to mention maybe a few ways of doing that very briefly.
Yeah, please.
So one way, and this is part of the unfolding of insight in Vipassana practice, is we can begin at different times to see and to really experience consciousness itself as arising and passing in each moment. So we're seeing the impermanent nature of consciousness. And so that cuts through then, or helps to cut through the identification with it, because we're seeing its impermanent nature. We can also see it, and this is found in some of the Zen traditions or Tibetan Dzogchen tradition, and it's a practice I like a lot and use in my practice, where they'll suggest to look for awareness. The question, can you find it? And there's a famous Zen dialogue, which I really love. A student came to see Bodhidharma when he was still living in his cave. He was in his cave for 9 years, facing a wall, as the story goes. And this student came to him and said, please teach me. I'm suffering a lot. Please tranquilize my mind. And Bodhidharma says to him, show me your mind and I'll pacify it. And the student says, well, I've looked for it everywhere and I can't find it. And then Bodhidharma says, there, it's already pacified. And it's the non-findability of the mind. When we look for it, when we look for the knowing, when we look for awareness, there's no thing to find. And yet the knowing is still there, but it can't be found. And in that moment of recognizing its unfindability, there is no identification with it. So it really brings us back to what I call the zero center. Instead of the center of our experiencing being one, I'm using numbers now to, as a metaphor. So instead of the one of the observer, it's the zero center, where there's no self, no I, no reference point. So I kind of lost the train of what we were discussing in this
No,
in this little rap.
That's because we got into 0 point, which is a scary concept of no reference whatsoever.
Well, let me just give you another teaching, which may make it a little less scary. And this is a teaching from Kala Rinpoche, one of the great Tibetan masters. He said, we live in illusion and the appearance of things. There is a reality. You are that reality. When you understand this, you see that you are nothing. Being nothing, you are everything. That is all. And so often people stop with the you are nothing and don't realize the implication of being nothing, which is becoming everything.
Yeah.
It's like, what's left when we are nothing? What's left is everything.
Yeah.
And so that gives a whole different flavor to the experience of it.
Yeah. Well, and that's people's constant misunderstanding of emptiness.
Yes.
It's nihilistic. And my best story around that it said it all to me. I've repeated this quite a few times, but I was with Roshi Joan Halifax, I think you know her, and doing a podcast, and it just came to me. She spent so much time with Ram Dass. She's so close to him, but she's an ultra Zen person.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Really something. Yes. She's a something else. Okay, that's all I got to say about her. And I said, what do you think about Neem Karoli Baba? I mean, you're always around Ram Dass. He's got pictures everywhere, his stories. You've been in all these events with him. And she said, when I look at his picture and I look into his eyes, I see emptiness. And in that moment, I went, right.
Yes.
Empty of self, empty of duality, empty.
Yes.
This is what emptiness, and it was full of unconditional love.
Yes.
And it made it so clear to me what exactly, we were talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. When we're talking about, we're back to reality a little bit, getting real. So again, from Robert's book, the essence of living with reality is to continually surrender to what is. Surrenders, of course, that's like merit. That's a bad term. You have already created your own personal universe with your karmas, and now you must live in it. Everyone who has sown the wind will eventually reap the whirlwind. That's kind of a cute line. However, most people try to ride out their karmic storms by barricading themselves inside psychological houses. No building, however weatherproof, can withstand every tornado, earthquake, flood, and conflagration. Almost everyone accordingly finds himself or herself existentially homeless one day or another. And
Mhm.
to me, this was a great, succinctly putting what we do to ourselves in relation to uh, not surrendering to what is, and and um, and not understanding all of the tendencies that we've developed, just even in this lifetime. Never mind previous
Mhm.
lifetimes, which is a whole other thing. So I wonder if you can't address that, and maybe in the way of some of the practices that you've yourself used, and what you might suggest to students about the way that we do barricade ourselves by shying away from just being with the moment.
Well, I think it relates a lot to what we've been talking about. You know, um, I see it relating in two ways. That we barricade ourselves first in the very notion of self. You know, that there's someone, some substantial being inside who I am, and then we try to protect it or defend it or aggrandize it or satisfy it or gratify it, and it's all revolving around this notion of I, of some being, and that's the essential contraction. You know, instead of the zero center, we are living in the self center.
Hmm.
You know, and that's our whole world revolves around this self center. And it's kind of interesting, even in conventional language and understanding, even though philosophically we might have a hard time understanding selflessness. You know, it's not that's not an easy concept to um, really embody or understand deeply. But on some level, we all do intuitively know prob the problem of it. For example, just in the way we use language, we all know that, you know, when someone is self-centered, it's not a desirable quality. You know, it's if we have a friend who's very self-centered, we might, you know, think they might benefit from some therapy, you know, to become a little less self-centered.
Mm.
But it has a much deeper meaning than just the ordinary understanding of it. It's whether there is a self at the center of our way of being in the world. And that's the deepest kind of self-centeredness. And that is a limitation and a contraction, you know, and then we try to do everything, as I said, to protect it or defend it or satisfy it. So the freedom, as you know, from the passage you read, is freeing ourselves first from that concept or that notion or that felt experience of a self at the center of everything, and dropping more, even if it's just for moments at a time, into the zero center, where things are just arising out of causes and conditions, the karmic unfolding. So that's the first aspect of greater freedom. And then the second is when we're in that process, you know, and perhaps it's all unfolding um, more or less selflessly for a bit, uh, but then to see how that habit of leaning into the unfolding
Hmm.
is coloring everything. So that's another kind of, um, we could say, a contraction or another kind of unease. And that's where what we were talking about earlier, even if for moments of dropping back, there's nothing to want, because whatever we want will also just be passing away. So we drop back into the selfless not wanting of everything. So it's not, you know, as you were pointing out, it's not that it becomes this gray vacuity. It's the fullness of life. Everything is there, but it's not revolving around the self-center, and we're not caught in the wanting to become. And so we really do get taste. And I want to repeat again, this, I've mentioned it many times now. It's powerful to even have moments of this not wanting. We don't have to think of it as some far off aspiration. It's just for a few moments can, in our practice, in our life, can we drop back not wanting? And this is something else that I found really useful in my own meditation. When I have those moments of not leaning in to becoming, but just back in the flow of experience, not wanting, then to actually investigate or look at what is the quality of the mind in that not wanting. What is the nature of that not wanting mind? And we can see very clearly that it's really a mind of great peace. But then it becomes experiential, not some philosophic description. We're actually experiencing the peace of not wanting and the stress of wanting. So it becomes very real. And again, it might be just for a few short moments at a time, but it can be transformative.
Totally. And this, to me, is, of course, why we suggest to people to take some time in their lives, take a week or two, go to IMS in Barrie, and Joseph will take care of you. Although not, he stepped back a little bit, but he has people who will take care of you all day.
Yes.
Yeah, but certainly for that reason, it's the reason I've gone to India. I pretty much do my retreat in India and spent it, and more recently with this yogi I was talking about. By the way, it's interesting because you keep dropping back to the zero, and every time you said that, I'm reminded. I forget, somebody I was with said to him, "Where do you get to? You're obviously samadhi is there and all that." He says, he goes like this, zero.
Yes. Yes.
So it's an interesting
thing. I have really found zero to be a very powerful metaphor for the practice, and so I'll just a little anecdote about zero. I was in a bookstore one time and I was just browsing. I came across this book. The title was "The Nothing That Is." And so that title I had to buy the book, The Nothing That Is. Yeah. So the book is really about the history of the number zero. And the opening line of the book, the opening couple of lines, said, when you look at zero, you see nothing. When you look through it, you see the world.
Wow.
And and the whole rest of the book became a little too mathematical for me, but it was worth
that one line.
The book was worth those first two lines. When you look at zero, you see nothing. When you look through it, you see the world. And that's such an apt description of the nature of the non-wanting mind. So there's one other little meditative exercise. It's peripherally related, but which I found really helpful, and maybe some people listening to the podcast would like to experiment with it. What I found really interesting is just in the course of daily life. So this is not being on retreat. It's not even particularly, informal sitting. Just when I'm walking around, uh, I will often make a point of trying to notice the quickly passing thoughts in the mind. The very light ones, the ones that are not disturbing, they're not big dramas. They're just, you're going for a walk and you might think of things you have to do or things in the past. But so quickly passing, light, on one level, not a problem. What I found was that it was very interesting to really start paying attention and becoming mindful even of those quickly passing, light, non-problematic thoughts. I learned a few really interesting things. One is that many of those thoughts, even though they were not super impactful because they were quickly passing, many of them contained some notion of self, of I. What we want to do, some memories or some plans. So there was an I often embedded in the content of the thought. When we're not aware of those thoughts as being just thoughts, even though they're not particularly disturbing, in the moments that they're there and we're lost in them, we are reinforcing the sense of self. We're creating and strengthening that notion. But it often goes unnoticed because those thoughts are not particularly disturbing. So they don't necessarily call us to be mindful. And I was reminded, do you know the experience sometime when you wake up in the morning, you wake up and then maybe you drop back to sleep for a moment too, and you have a momentary dream, and then you wake up again, and then you're awake. Well, I realized that through the course of the day, with all of these quickly passing thoughts, it is exactly like falling back into that dream state for just those moments. Because in those moments, we're not aware that the thought is there. We're just in it. But it doesn't last long and it doesn't bother us too much, which is why we mostly ignore them. But what I realized by paying attention and keeping an eye out for them, to realize how many times in the course of a day, it's really quite pervasive. These light thoughts are happening countless times in a day. And each time they're arising, it's like we're dreaming ourselves into existence for those moments. We're back in a dream state. We're not aware either of the fact that we're thinking or where we actually are in that moment, because we've been pulled into that thought world. Right? And so it's like being in the dream. And the dream often revolves around some notion of self. And so that became a little mantra for me. Oh, I'm just dreaming myself into existence. And it's a great reminder through the day to keep an eye out for those. And it's tremendously entertaining. I love to do it because it so reveals how much of the time we are lost in a dream, that we're not really awake to the moment.
Yeah.
So I find it a very engaging practice.
And just referring to some of the things we've been talking about around karma, this is these kind of subtle mind states create our world here.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's one thing before we, I'm keeping you here, but before we close, when we talk about we've been talking about getting real. We've been talking about how karma affects us on a day-to-day basis and our awareness factor and self-identification. I think there's one thing in the book, Mindfulness. It's another Buddhist phrase that's very difficult, yet I have spent I would say, more time with it than almost any other, because I find it has within it real solutions to having a perspective that can allow some of this reification that we're talking about, some of the reinforcement of the big me movie, the I, and I'd love for you to talk about it. It's dependent origination. Uh, you can give us a 2-sentence explanation and definition of a dependent origination, but no, just a little, Joseph. I know this is a huge topic and it's a big section of the book, and but everybody go out there and buy this book, okay? So you know what the hell Joseph's talking about. But yeah, dependent origination, because I think it goes a long way. It can help to have an awareness of
Yeah,
that
well,
concept.
as you said, this is one of the deepest and most profound aspects of the Buddha's teaching. So
Hmm.
Even the Buddha admonished Ananda, his cousin and attendant and very beloved monk in the Buddha's times, when Ananda was saying how much he appreciated and understood the law of dependent origination, and the Buddha said, "Don't say so, Ananda. This teaching is deep and profound." So this will just be kind of the lightest of forays into it. And basically, it does have to do with the karmic unfolding and the way the whole process unfolds. And the Buddha discovered this, in the night of his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, when he was confronted with the question of basically the question of suffering, and what was the essential cause of suffering, and he traced it back through various links, and so just one catchy little teaching, which it always it's so obvious that we often overlook it. But when the Buddha asked, "What is the cause of death?" the Buddha said, "The cause of death is birth." That whatever is born will also die. And so then there are a lot of links in between. So just to give an example of a few links in this chain of dependent origination, it's usually described as 12 links of how one thing leads to another. And so often in the meditation world, we highlight a few of these links because it highlights the place where it highlights how the links can lead to suffering, or how that chain can be broken at certain points. So, for example, one of the links in the chain is just the experience of sense contact. This contact in seeing and hearing and smelling, tasting, feeling in the body, thoughts. So there's contact with the sense object. So that's one of the links. The Buddha said, because of contact, or wherever there is contact, there is also a feeling tone, that in that contact, it's always experienced as being either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, neither pleasant or unpleasant. So in the chain of dependent origination, contact goes to feeling. So the next link in the chain, the Buddha pointed out, and this is something that we really want to observe for ourselves, experience for ourselves, that conditioned by pleasant feeling, without mindfulness, the next link becomes desire. And this is common. Most of us want what's pleasant and don't want what's unpleasant. So contact conditions feeling, feeling unmindfully experience conditions craving, craving then conditions the next link, which is clinging, which then goes to becoming, which then goes to rebirth. So the whole unfolding happens through these links of dependent origination. But right there in that moment of noticing feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, if we're actually mindful of that, oh, pleasant, pleasant, unpleasant, if we're mindful of it, then we don't need to go to desire for the pleasant or aversion to the unpleasant. We can simply be in the experience, oh, pleasant. We're just mindful, we're experiencing it as pleasant without wanting. We can experience unpleasant without wanting. And right there is a doorway to freedom. You know, that's a place in the chain where we can break the chain of conditioning that leads to suffering. So this is just kind of a very broad, overview or a suggestion of how it works and where we might apply it in our practice. There's one teaching of the Buddha which every time I read it or think about it, it sort of makes me sit up straight in terms of understanding the magnitude of the practice. This is no small thing. If the aspiration is liberation, if the aspiration is really freedom, this is not a small thing. This is a radical transformation of the conditioning of our minds. And so the Buddha highlighted what's necessary for complete liberation. And he said, and this is the teaching that always both inspires me and encourages. He said, as long as there's attachment to the pleasant and aversion to the unpleasant, liberation is impossible. So that's quite a statement, because as we know from our own experience, this attachment to pleasant and aversion to unpleasant is pretty deeply rooted.
Moment to moment.
Exactly. And so even if not to wait until the final eradication of attachment and aversion, but in a moment we can taste it.
Yeah. And that goes back to a little bit of what you were saying before. This is not something that in one fell swoop, it's all going to just transform, because that is not the nature of practice. It is, and any moment that we can get to the zero of the zero is a beautiful moment, and those moments, they inform the next moments, and in my mind they absolutely can change karma. They can inform karma.
Yes.
Because you have that intention is there, and it's not just that's just a little thing that happened. No, it's actually a big thing. Yes. Because it builds. It's like building blocks, and a lifetime of those building blocks makes the Tibetans say the whole deal here is to prepare for that one moment when you die. Yeah. And where's your consciousness going to be in that moment? Yeah.
So just another kind of metaphor or simile for this whole process. It's like you go to a movie, and get totally engrossed in the story. And so that you could see that as the karmic unfolding of our lives. We're lost in the story of our lives and our personalities. But maybe for people who meditate a bit, or maybe others, every once in a while you're in a movie, and having been completely absorbed in the story, which is the whole point of going, But maybe there are certain moments when you realize, oh, this is just a movie. Nothing is really going on. You know, nobody's getting chased, nobody's getting killed, nobody's falling in love, nobody is whatever the story of the movie is. It's just a movie. It's just pixels of light on a screen. And we might have a moment of remembering that and then get reabsorbed in the story. But that moment has revealed something about the nature of reality. So even though it may be just a moment, that's a powerful seed for not taking the story to be so real.
Yeah.
And we are lost in the movies of our minds. We are lost in the stories of our lives. And so to have these moments of whatever we call it, the zero center, you know, or moments of not wanting, we drop out of the story for a moment, and we actually experience or taste another whole level of reality. So as you said, these moments, even if they're short, can be transformative.
Yeah. It's kind of like a breath of fresh air after you've been
Exactly.
inside
Yes. Yes.
and you go outside and you're just in that complete, you are complete in that moment of breathing in that fresh
Yes.
air. Yeah. Hey, listen, if you could do one more little thing, Joseph, I know it would be great to have just maybe a couple of a short few minute practice designed for basically
Everybody.
yeah. Well, no, I was going to say I'm giving you a specific thing that you can just turn out like like a computer. But I'm thinking about all of us on a day-to-day basis, and we may be going through something, and an untoward word from a coworker, a call from a wife or husband, a child, annoying, whatever it may be that grabs our attention. Just a way to, in the moment, just sit in as quiet a place as you can get, or just walk somewhere where a little bit of a practice that we can engage back behind the movie of me, as Krishna Das likes to call it.
I like that, the movie of me. That's great. Yeah, well, we'll just do a couple of minutes of a basic practice of being aware and awake. So in whatever posture you may be in as you've been listening, can relax back into that posture, whether it's sitting or standing. You might let the eyes close gently, although it's also possible to sit with the eyes open. And just get a sense of the body in that posture. There's a phrase that I like to use which helps to ground this awareness. There is a body. There is a body. And that becomes a framework for allowing whatever experience of the body there is to emerge. There is a body. Feel the sensations of the posture. You might feel the sensations of the body breathing. No expectations, no wanting. There is a body. In that awareness, there is a body. What is revealed? Different sensations, feeling of the breath. Within that framework, there is a body. You might hear sounds. And notice any quickly passing thoughts or images, seeing how they arise and pass. How empty they are of substance. There is a body. Being with whatever arises, without wanting, without expectation. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. Resting in the zero center of not wanting. And then pervading the space of open emptiness with thoughts and feelings of loving kindness and compassion. May all beings live happily and at peace. Perhaps feeling the breath at the heart center, radiating the wish. May all beings everywhere live happily and at peace. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes and engage with that same quality of feeling with the world around you.
Thank you, Joseph.
You're very welcome.
Beautiful. So, I got into a little bit of the zero here. Not good for a talky podcasty. We'll see you next week. Buy this, but do get Joseph's book, Mindfulness. I can't more readily suggest something that would be helpful on a day-to-day basis. And thanks so much for being here, Joseph.
You're very welcome. We did get into some
yeah,
interesting depths.
Yes, no, we did. So this is Mindrolling, and Raghu and I will be back next week, and we look forward to seeing you there. Go to BeHereNowNetwork.com, and you go to Mindrolling, and we're going to have all the information on like how to get Joseph's book and some of the other things we're talking about. We're going to have that all available as links to make it easy, and some show notes. And we'll see you next time.